Have you ever experienced being energized or committed during the day and you thought by yourself, there's got to be something in you. Something's got to be up. Was probably nothing. However, if you've experienced it for more than 4 days, then you might have experienced hypomania. My name is Jacob Alderetti, and today I'll present my bachelor thesis presentation on the role of epigenetics on hypomania with the multi-order adaptive model. Well, there's a high chance, a very high chance, you've never heard of hypomania since it's one of those mood episodes that is rarely talked about or even diagnosed. So I thought it would be interesting to make an entire thesis about it. All right. First, we'll talk about the background of hypomania, what it is, what causes it, what triggers it. Then we move on to what epigenetics is. Then we'll continue talking about the model with the graph. And finally, we'll see how the simulation plays out. And then we conclude this presentation with a discussion. Well, first, what is hypomania? Well, according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the scientific definition is as follows. It's a distinct period of abnormally and persistently elevated expansive or irritable mood and abnormally and persistently increased activity and energy, lasting at least 4 consecutive days and present most of the day, nearly every day. Well, there's a lot of buzzwords. We'll get to it. We'll get to this. The key takeaway of this is that it lasts at least 4 days. Some of the symptoms include talking a lot, an increased focus, less need for sleep, an increased libido, and et cetera, et cetera. If I had to describe it in just a few words, I would just say it's an increase in energy. It's the correct term, not necessarily, but you get the idea. Well, hypomania is not to be confused with its older, more famous, and way bigger brother, mania. Hypo means below, below in Greek. And because mania, you've probably heard of it, that's a mood episode where, perceived on the outside, you can see significant negative differences between your everyday life. Someone with hypomania, you might think that person has a very good day, or is very energetic, or very, very impulsive. With mania, you might actually have to go to the hospital because you're in such an elevated state that you might end up hurting yourself or someone else. Hypomania is often associated with bipolar disorder or cyclothymic disorder, which are both mood episodes, mood disorders. Now, what happens in the brain when a person has hypomania? Well, as you can see in the slide, you can see it over here. Here we have the amygdala, and the amygdala is the feeling part of the brain. It processes all the feelings, and it processes the feelings. And we can see when someone has hypomania, you can see an increase in the activity of the amygdala. This causes the impulsive behavior, that causes the mood swings, that causes the hyperfocus, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is due to the fact that there's insignificant top-down control from the prefrontal cortex. Prefrontal cortex does a lot of things. Right now, we're focusing on one of its functions, which is regulating emotions. The prefrontal cortex, when someone experiences hypomania or has a hypomanic episode, we can see that the prefrontal cortex does not send out the right signals to this amygdala, which causes the increase in the amygdala. Well, hypomania is most likely due to the high spikes in dopamine. And these high spikes of dopamine can be caused due to drugs, a lack of sleep, high stress levels, or a life shift. Imagine losing a loved one, for example, when you go to a funeral, or gaining a loved one, for example, when marrying someone, or a charged atmosphere or circumstances. Imagine like a concert where there's a very high amount of stimulus. Now, when doing the research for hypomania, there are a couple of genes that stood out, specifically the COMT gene. Since the COMT gene is closely associated with dopamine levels. Since the COMT gene, excuse me, I want too fast. Since the COMT gene breaks down specific chemical messengers known as neurotransmitters in the brain. Neurotransmitters such as dopamine must signal to the prefrontal cortex in order to work effectively. Well, what is epigenetics? Well, first, we have to look at how a gene expresses itself, gene expression. A gene expresses itself through three variables: the genes that you get from your mother and your father, the environmental factors, and the lifestyle choices. Epigenetics focuses specifically on this part. Environmental factors you can think of, for example, where you live, how much sunlight you're getting, for example, or lifestyle choices, which, for example, means like if you choose to eat a healthy diet or a non-healthy diet. Well, how does a gene actually express itself? First, you have genes which are read and transcribed into RNA, which are then transcribed into proteins. And these proteins, they determine the behavior and characteristics of cells, and these cells make up who you are. DNA methylation, an epigenetic process, is one way how your body controls which genes are active without changing your actual DNA. Well, let's talk about the higher order adaptive self model. This model is a model that updates itself, and it changes based on the conditions. It changes on the parameters. What makes this model higher order is the fact that it has multiple levels, 5 adaptation levels plus a base level. This will become more clear in a second. Well, first you can see the graphical representation. This one inside. We're going to go to this step by step, but first I want you to take a look at the base level. Here you can see the person experiencing normal stress levels. And these normal stress levels causes the dopamine levels, the DL, to rise. However, the prefrontal cortex, this does a job, does a job to regulate those emotions and regulates it. Make sure that it keeps the dopamine levels, it doesn't stay very high. This is all in relation with the preparation state, just basically your body preparing for the next emotion, and the feeling state, which is in this scenario could be seen as the amygdala. Well, once this state is being affected by a light shift, a lack of sleep, or charged atmosphere, your mind will sense these life-changing events. This is excuse me. That's the double S, the sensory state. And it will read and translate it, these senses, the sensory representation states, which causes the dopamine levels to spike out of control. Which means that the dopamine levels will it will reach a peak that it hasn't been seen before, or with the body that it hasn't been seen before. This kickstarts this entire process. When looking at the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth order, you can actually just look at it as zooming in on a micro level. Here you have the brain structure. The first order is the brain structure. The second is the protein production. The third is the RNA activation. The fourth is the gene part, and the fifth and last but not least is the epigenetic process, the methylation. Now, what happens? So once the dopamine levels rise, this epigenetic process starts, which impacts the COM gene in a negative way. It causes the COM gene to be less active. With other words, it means it breaks down those dopamine levels in a less effective way, which basically means that there's too much dopamine in your body right now, which causes less RNA activation, less protein productions, and then it affects the connectivity of the brain, in the brain. In a second, this will become more clear when we look at the simulation. So here we can see the simulation. And first, I want you to take a look at the first part, this part from 0 to 100. Here we can see the process in the base level. And here we can see the process in the higher order levels, in the higher order levels. Oh, excuse me. When this first yellow thing, just yellow line, that is the normal stress levels, the NS. And as you can see, the dopamine levels rises, the amygdala activity in the amygdala rises, which is the blue one. The purple one's dopamine levels. The red one preparation state, all these rises, but they fluctuate. They're not staying very high, and they're not staying very high. Exactly the same in the higher order. In the higher order, you can see it rises. You can see all these the connectivity protein rises, but it's not significantly enough to make a lasting impact. Well, at time step 100, the y-axis is the, as you can say, the activity, and the 0 to 400 is the timestamp. As you can see, at 100, here a person experiences a high stress level. The charged atmosphere, the lack of sleep, etc., etc. This kickstarts the hypomanic episodes. As you can see, the dopamine levels, they rise. The amygdala, the FSB, they rise. The preparation state, it rises. And also in the higher order, all these things rises. In this specific model, the dysfunction of the prefrontal cortex has been shown with any activity in the prefrontal cortex. So when it was here at the base, at the bottom, it was working fine. But the moment it increased, then you can see a disruption in the prefrontal cortex. Now, even though the hypomanic episode is over, so the person does not experience any, for example, it does not have their charged atmosphere anymore. It does not have its major life shift anymore, or maybe become accustomed to it. You can see that these processes still remain. These epigenetic factors, they have lasting consequences on the person. So even though the hypomanic episode is over, it still has lasting consequences on the human. Now, let's talk about the discussion real quick. First, this is one of the key strengths of this model, is that it's the first model linking epigenetics and hypomania, which could future support brain-related studies. However, this research is mostly based on research conducted on bipolar disorder or mania. So this thesis cannot say with 100% certainty that the model based right now is specifically for hypomania, or just people with bipolar disorder which have hypomania. Also, a lot of the research on this paper has been influenced by the research on mania itself. Also, the COM gene is a hypothesis due to the fact that the COM gene has strong ties with dopamine breakdown. That's the reason that the COM gene has been chosen. However, this is not proven. Further research is required to say for certain. Well, however, at the end of the day, now you know if you have a very energetic episode and you think, it lasts more than 4 days, then you might have hypomania. But if it lasts more than 7 days and is way too extent and is getting out of proportion, you might need to go to the hospital. This was my bachelor thesis presentation. I want to thank Jan Treur specifically for guiding me through the process, and I'm excited to answer your questions about it.